Hello, interwebs! I hope you are all doing well because I and my cat Kipo here are here to review the latest episode and Season 2 premiere of HBO's The Last of Us, this episode titled Future Days. So first things first, I'm going to let you all know right up front, I am someone who has played the game. So I know what is, or at least know potentially some future spoilers here. However, I'm going to structure each one of my reviews this season where I am going to just flat talk about the episode as is first, with no context of the game as best I can, and when there are scenes or moments, as there will be in this episode, where I really cannot talk about the scene without bringing in the context for the game, I will save that for the very end of the video and give a clear spoiler warning for game spoilers at that point, so you can jump off if you have not played the game. I also will use that post section to talk about anything that I want to add on to the discussion from scenes that I may have already discussed, but I already can tell right from the start of this episode that there are just going to be some scenes that I just cannot speak on until I bring in game context, because it's just, I don't even want to say too much about it. For those of you who played the game, if you know, you know. And I'm going to let Kipo down because he doesn't want to get spoiled either. So just letting you know first, we'll talk about the episode without any spoilers from the game or anything like that front up. And I'll give a warning, is basically the long and short of it. So, starting off this episode, I'm not going to talk about that opening sequence that we get with the character of Abby. I'll save that for the game stuff, because obviously that scene is more just foreshadowing and alluding to things that are going to be coming down the line with her character, so I'll save that for there. What I will say is I found this episode to be kind of an interesting one, even sans the game context, because it is a much slower paced episode, kind of giving us a sense of where Joel and Ellie are at, and we get a sense, obviously, that there's a rift in their relationship. Again, not going to say what I know about what caused that. Obviously, there are some guesses that people could probably make around that, given the therapist scene that we get, where it's clear that it has something to do with what happened at the end of Season 1, especially since we get that that moment sort of reiterating the last beat of the end of Season 1 here at the start of this episode, sort of as a reminder context. So we know it has something obviously to do with that, and that is probably the potential for their rift, is basically where I'll sort of leave it on that front. However, I really liked how naturalized that they portrayed this. It whenever you see these types of riffs, it's very easy to play them up and play up like, oh, they're angry at each other, they're not talking to each other, da-da-da-da-da. But I like how it feels very just distant. They're just distant with each other. And you can see how they're not willing to talk to each other, as that one therapist scene says. I love that quick scene that we get where Joel at the end of the episode comes in and just grabs the guitar. You can tell that Ellie's tolerating his presence. She's not going to yell at him to get away or anything like that. It's not like a big explosion or argument. And Joel is just trying to do something. He's just trying to do something tangible to fix it, but he doesn't have the emotional intelligence to just talk it out. And I like that. And it's kind of, again, both of them are kind of like that. And I adored that therapist scene that we get at the top of this episode, which is a Holy Show invention, if I am recalling correctly, and portrayed so amazingly by Moira from Schitt's Creek, by the way. I loved that for her. And I love how just nonchalant she is. I'm drinking, it's fine. This is my first birthday without my husband. Now, going back through the scene with that knowledge, you see what she's kind of doing, seeding that information there, and making Joel uncomfortable. And I just love that whole sequence of just building Joel up. And she basically confronts him on his bullshit and says, name the thing that you want to talk about, that you actually want to talk about. And the whole thing where she confronts him with it, and she says, now that I've named it, we can actually talk about it out in the open and potentially heal this. It lands so well, in just one whole scene. It manages to get across the problem that Joel has, which is he does not wish to talk about things. He does not wish to admit anything or any wrongdoing or any level of just emotional work that he has to do to reach out to where Ellie is at any point. And he just sees it from his point of view, never Ellie's, by saying, I saved her. And you get across the vulnerable, Pedro Pascal is so amazing. He gets across that vulnerability that he almost lets down in that scene, and yet you see the walls come right back up. It was an absolute freaking masterwork there. I also really enjoyed the relationship between Ellie and Dina. I was worried about this because I do really like those two characters in that relationship from the game, and so I was curious to see how much chemistry they were gonna have. Bella was gonna have with the new actor, and I think both of them just play off each other so well. There's a lot of fun between the two of them. Bella Ramsey, I think, just nails the kid sort of like nonchalance in there and rebelliousness and the sort of like playfulness that she has with Dina. She for Ellie's character, by the way, because Bella, I believe, uses just completely they, them pronouns. So just wanted to be clear on that there. So I really just, their chemistry, like when they're going up against the clicker in the grocery store, was really, really cool and just a lot of fun and felt like straight up out of the video games. That whole sequence was just straight up out of the video games, them crouching, throwing bottles, all of that stuff. Just felt very video gamey in the best way possible. Loved that. One thing though that does sort of rub up against me a little bit is just their clear disdain for the rules. Not to say that it reads very true for like young adults / teenagers. I know they're probably in, I think, late teens, early 20s. Don't know the exact age, but somewhere in that vicinity. Being that rebellious very much reads true in a lot of counts, but it's a little overemphasized a few times, I think, throughout this episode. So it kind of just reads as like, oh, we're just going to really hit this point home that they don't pay attention to the rules. They're a little bit rebellious. I think it was just a hair too much overemphasized for me. That being said, it's not that it doesn't like distract too much, but it just is a little bit of like, oh, I see what you're doing, episode. I see what you're trying to go for, and you felt it land a little bit too hard throughout the episode. That being said, to bring it back to a positive, the sequence inside the grocery store when Ellie fell down into it was really, really good, save for one shot that I didn't particularly like. It was absolutely freaking terrifying seeing that thing scuttle in the background and between the shelves as Ellie is just missing it every single time. All confronting up to the moment where you get to see its close face and the little tendrils sticking out of its nose, and sort of foreshadowing what's going to happen at the end of the episode there that we get to see. I thought that was really, really cool, and the fact that it was intelligent is very, very intriguing, and I'm super curious to see where ultimately that's going to go with having intelligent stalking clickers, or infected, I should say, because clickers are technically a type of infected. So really just very cool to see that play out and get the visual of that. Just very well done. The effects makeup on the show has always been phenomenal, but even that was just really, really wonderful. So adored all of that. The one shot that I will say I do have a negative on is they did cut to briefly as Ellie was sort of walking to the grocery store aisles, the stalker crawling on the ground from a close-up shot from behind, and I'm sort of like, it worked better for me when we stayed at a distance and sort of felt like the creeping tension of it being in the distance from Ellie. By cutting in close to it, I felt like it was just, it kind of brought us into it a little bit too much, into its perspective, where I would have much rather stayed in Ellie's the entire time. It's a preference, but it felt like it just could have threw us out of the perspective of Ellie for a minute and like a little bit ruined the tension of getting to see kind of what it was. I actually will say at first when it didn't run at Ellie, I almost thought it was Dina just fucking around, and I was like, man, I really hope that's not the case, because like Ellie could totally shoot Dina in the face. Thankfully it wasn't the case, but yeah, it was interesting because I really thought it was Dina for a hot second there. I also really loved the fact that Ellie gets bit and has to sort of like hide the bite mark and then tie it up. She couldn't just let like the bite stand because people may notice and then ask questions and get worried, and put her in danger and all that jazz. So that was just an interesting little moment of how she has to sort of take care of that herself. One wonders if she was on better terms with Joel, if they would have actually talked that out. Did also like seeing a council. It was nice seeing a council, you know, a very communistic sort of representation there. Very fun. Enjoyed that aspect of just seeing this society working. And then the dance sequence. You know, this isn't necessarily game spoiler stuff. This is a scene just taken right from the game, almost one for one, and plays exactly the same. And I think it's great within this context. I think I always loved that line of like, oh, they should be terrified of you. Such great foreshadowing of who Ellie is and the danger that she has. It just plays very menacing in a really fun way in multiple contexts. So just great scene. Not much to say about it because it's already been talked ad nauseum about within the game context, because it was literally the first scene I think we ever, first or second scene, I think the first scene we ever saw was like Ellie playing the guitar for like the first teaser for Last of Us Part 2, but certainly was one of the first teasers that we ever got for Last of Us. And adored that from front to back. So it's a really, really great scene. The only other thing that I'll really talk about before we get into greater video game context is the tendrils that we see coming out of the pipe at the end. This has already been talked about in Season 1. They changed up the way infections work in the game, because the infections in the game are just, I think, mainly just through spores. If you breathe in the spores, you become infected. Whereas in the show, it has like the roots, and you have to get it through bites and stuff like that. And there's like the sort of root system that runs through everything that can sort of connect their brains and minds together in sort of like a hive mindy sort of thing that we're seeing coming in to this society here. So interesting to see that play a bigger role in the story-wise, or at least hinted at to play a bigger role in the story here at the end of this episode. So curious to see where that's going to go, because again, this was talked about in Season 1. It's a distinct difference in the way the infection works. So I'm ultimately curious to see how it's going to play out in the grand scheme of where the story goes with that. So enjoyed that. And then obviously at the end of the episode, we come back to the character of Abby. Again, not going to talk too much about that until we get into game stuff. So let me give that warning now. If you do not want to have potentially the show spoiled for you or the game spoiled for you at all, please jump out here, because I have thoughts and opinions on the video game connections to this episode. So just making that very clear, jump off now, because we're going to talk about it. Okay, so I think it's very, very interesting, before we even get to the Abby of it all, I think it's very, very interesting that we're getting a more linear story here. Again, I'll get to the Abby part of it here, but like that dance sequence in the game comes very much at the end of the story. And I think it for me, it kind of lands stronger there, just based on the emotional context that it comes within, of like the dangerous person and angry person that Ellie has become at that point, and kind of how much she's been willing to give up and lose in her pursuit of revenge. And when we flash back to see this, and sort of like the tensions that she had with Joel, as well as the relationship with Dina that she kind of lost. So like, I think it loses it by having this scene appear in a linear way. That being said, it also plays here as kind of a foreshadowing moment now, instead of a juxtaposition moment as it did in the game. Especially considering this, again, as I said in the non-spoiler section for the game, this is a scene we did see first before the game even came out. So we were always keeping it in our mind. And I think for most of us, not everyone, but for most of us who were sort of following the release of the game, it was something that we were already aware of and having seen. So it's sort of interesting now that like the show is sort of mirroring that experience in kind of a weird way. So just kind of interesting there. Also, the Stalker, the intelligent infected. I do believe we get Stalkers in the game. It's been a hot minute, but I don't think there was a huge emphasis placed on like them having particular intelligence. So that's interesting to see what they're going to pull from that in the game. And then also the fact that we get the little tendrils coming into their encampment. So curious to see where that's going to go, because again, to my memory, it never got into their encampment in the game. The encampment was essentially, the settlement was just safe the entire time. So curious to see what they're building to there, if they're actually going to like destroy the encampment or have it get attacked from the inside. That would definitely be a very distinct change from the game. Okay, two big things, but let's start off with the biggest one that I know everyone already wants me to talk about. Abby. They put her up front. Now, for those of you who have not played the game but are still here, just to give context, in the game, I'm going to, again, full spoilers here, letting y'all know. In the game, we meet Abby very soon before she ultimately, spoiler again, I'm just giving all the warnings here, kills Joel. And that sort of sets off the rest of the game. And we don't get any context or her motivation until much, 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 much later in the game. And it's interesting to me that they decided to put up at least a form of her motive right at the top. because it reads to me that the show is very much trying to mitigate the backlash that the game got for its decision to not have you have any insight into who Abby is and why she was there before she kills off Joel. I was there, and certainly that was a huge backlash moment, especially considering that it was also part of the leaks for the game that came up before the game. There's a part of me that understands why they want to mitigate the potential backlash, because it was so toxic, especially not just towards the game itself, but the people involved. Abby got a shit ton of harassment, as I'm sure did a lot of the devs. So yeah, it's one I understand, and certainly I think on some level too, by having that backlash for some folks, it pushed them out of what the game was trying to get them to understand what the game was trying to say, which was about like forgiveness and cycles of violence and how we get pulled into those cycles of violence and how do we break them. And so I think that I understand why they did it on some level, but to me, I think there's a personal part of me that also thinks that just generally makes things weaker. I understand why they did it, but I think, the way the scene is done, where we get like a very clear understanding of they're talking about Joel, they're talking about what he did. We may not know exactly why Abby is so particularly pissed at Joel, but we have some sense of it. Obviously, again, spoiler for the game, Joel killed Abby's dad. And that is why she's so particularly angry. But I think based on this scene, and maybe people who have watched the show will feel different, but I feel like you get enough to know like she's pissed about like someone in particular having died, and I feel like the information that may get delivered down the line that Joel killed her dad will A, not come as that much of a surprise, and B, have a lot less of an impact as it did in the show. It's definitely gonna have a lot less of an impact, but I think even just having that as like an extra revelation spice on top later on, I don't think it'll have any of the level of like what the game was trying to do, and I think will ultimately weaken what the game was trying to do, because ultimately, backlash aside, I personally, and this is a personal thing, people obviously will have many different opinions on this. I really liked that challenge that the game was forcing me to reckon with, of like, Joel is not a particularly great dude, and he did cause harm, and while we as the audience may identify with him and like him because we played as him, we understand his motivations, we understand his perspective, we tend to, as a culture, tend to want to empathize more with the complicated dad figure characters, just as a general rule in our culture, as opposed to gender non-conforming women characters who hurt them, the daddy characters that we love. I think it was a very cool challenge to have us be in Ellie's perspective and then be forced to try to reckon with Abby's perspective down the line. I think that was just a strong narrative risk that I think made really, really powerful. And it's very unfortunate that, again, there are good faith versions of like discussing whether or not it was effective for you. I think there very much is and was, but I think the backlash in particular was just so toxic at that decision that I think they just backed away from it, and as a result, I think it just weakens what made that game interesting as a narrative to me. And so I worry ultimately, like, I think they could still pull off something very interesting, but I think the power a lot of that game was its structure, and how it, like, that structure forced us to try to emotionally live through the very feelings that the game was asking us to try to break. It was asking us to feel the anger at Abby and then try to understand her and try to understand to break that sort of like cycle of violence perspective. And I think that that's like really risky and cool, and I wish they had kept it, even as I also very much understand why they decided not to. And I'm sure it must have been a very contentious debate in the writer's room, and maybe even from producers on the show. I wouldn't even be surprised if HBO came in being like, hey, we saw that backlash, we don't want that, you're doing it this way. So I could even see it being a producerial decision, could also see it being just a straight up creative decision. I don't know, but it is an interesting one, and one that we'll see what they make of it. And obviously there's some different directions that they're going with in this episode already, that maybe they're completely trying to do something different, and maybe this decision will make more sense for what they're trying to do in the show. But as it stands right now, I'm cautious, but not a little bit hesitant on the decision as it stands right now. So curious on that front. Also, I'm just gonna put this out there, and I just kind of wanted to say it. I am a little bit sad that Abby's not like a buff, strong-ass woman like she was in the game. I think that was another part of the backlash. There was a lot of like misogynistic and gendered and also transphobic, toxic shit put onto the character of Abby herself because she was specifically non-gender conforming, as happens to a lot of stereotypical, aka like very sexualized femininity in gaming culture often. So I'm a little bit disappointed by that. Nothing to do with the actress. I think I've seen her in other things and I think she's really good. So this is not like a slight at her necessarily, just a choice. I'm like, there's a part of me that's disappointed. That being said, I do believe that like Bella Ramsey has to reasonably be able to take her on later on. So, maybe that was also part of the decision there because Bella is a bit smaller, I think, than Ellie is in, or at least not as buff as Ellie is in the game, even though Ellie is not like swole. She is, I think, a little bit more so than Bella necessarily is. So maybe that was also part of the decision making. But there is a little bit of like, I just like seeing buff women on screen, so sue me. So there's a little bit of disappointment there. And also sort of like, I just like seeing non-gender conforming women generally. So there's just that. I think ultimately, at the end of the day, I think this is a decent start to the season. Certainly has me curious to see what they're going to be doing, especially in terms of the changes to the structure of the game. But it is a slow start. I honestly kind of expected the premiere to end with Joel being killed right out of the bat. So I think probably part of it is I'm curious to see if they'll end up killing Joel by the end of episode 2 or even within episode 2, or if they're going to try and keep Pedro around. My initial guess was they were going to kill Pedro at the end of episode 1, but then he'd be coming back fairly regularly for flashbacks. But we've not all of them, but we kind of burned through a lot of the flashback stuff that we did get within the context of the game. Not all of it, but some of it. And so I'm curious to see what their plan is, if they're just trying to like extend out Pedro Pascal as long as they possibly can, to keep him in the front part of this, that people don't get too upset when he does eventually off it. Or hell, the big risk would be if they don't kill him at all. That would be a big change from the game. I don't know if they'd go that far, but certainly it would be interesting if they did. If they did take that huge of a swerve from the game's narrative and didn't kill him off and do something different, which clearly they're setting up some possibilities for difference. Might be interesting, but I think that would be too far. It would just take the narrative in wildly different directions. It would necessarily have to go in wildly different directions. So I don't think they'll go that far. So the question more to me is how long until Pedro kicks it. I'm guessing probably by the end of next episode, but we shall see. That's everything that I had for this review. I'd love to hear all your thoughts down below. Beyond all of that, my friends, I hope you, as always, live long and prosper.